And that's been hard. I still feel I saw missionaries on the bus the other day, or a few weeks ago, I guess at this point, and like I just felt this immediate like care and kinship for them. Like these are my people, and I have a responsibility for them, and I still feel that. And in that same sense, like the Book of Mormon is still a very important text for me.
Mm.
I will, in as much as you can call anything for me at this point scripture, like Mosiah 4 and the injunction about the poor, about caring for the poor and the needy, is scripture for me. It pops into my head as like an indictment of how I react to the poor and the needy, and it's as well as like this, like, in direction of like what I need to do, but also like for society at large and all of that. Like for me, that is scripture.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. In today's episode, I have with me a friend of mine and a listener, Tyler Perry. Tyler, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this. So
yeah, this should be fun. You're currently living in Europe.
Yeah. Just recently moved to Sweden, and enjoying a different environment. It's getting cold though.
Yeah, I was thinking the climate, I think it's quite cold. Over there, you get snow in winter.
It hit the equinox, and then it just started cooling off right away, getting darker and all of that. So starting to get that authentic Swedish experience a little bit. So.
Well, we're kind of getting the same here. Like I left the gym the other night at like 7 o'clock and it was just pitch black. I'm like, whoa. And it's gone like really windy and cold because we had like a week of like heat wave kind of weather, like 20 something degrees, which is quite rare in September, and then it just dropped.
It was nice for that. It was really nice for that week or so where it seemed like we had that kind of authentic fall, or maybe a little bit of a resurgence of summer. And yeah, now we're getting it. Now we're getting paying our dues. So.
I know, but we're not here to talk about the weather.
We are not.
Tyler is a listener of the channel. You're a former member of the church, so you've left the church.
Hey, let's be very specific here. I am still on the rolls. So
okay, you're still on the rolls, but you no longer attend, right. No longer believing. You engage quite a lot with my content. You're probably one of my, I would say, faithful listeners that watch nearly every episode, and you respond to it as well. We'll talk more about that later. So you engage with it. I don't think I give you the number one fan. I still think Richard is probably my number one follower and commenter. He has been from the beginning. Some people have said to me, like, should you not maybe block this guy? He's a little bit of a troll. I'm like, no. I'm like, he helps me with the algorithms and he loves my content. So I was like, I am keeping him. Shout out to you, Richard. But yeah, we've sort of engaged with each other. And I think that you're a very thoughtful person. I appreciate the fact that you engage with my videos and the arguments. You do it bit by bit. Right. So we thought it'd be fun to connect. So why don't we just start with a little about like your story? Like tell us where you're from, where you're born, were you born and raised in the church, and a little about like your background and upbringing in the church.
So this is where does my Mormon story begin, right?
Yeah. And this will hopefully not be as long as your typical Mormon story episode you would see in Mormon Stories podcast.
Hopefully not. No, so I was born in Northern California to a pretty solidly devout family. We kind of had a blend of like that McConkie era Mormonism attitude baked in with maybe a little bit more of some like the Hugh B. Brown type of trying to kind of approach things with the bigger tent and all of that. So I had a pretty robust experience actually in the theology that I was taught growing up. But I took
curiosity, is there a lot of members of the church in California?
In different parts of California, there are stronger concentrations of the church. In Northern California, it's often not quite as Mormon, but there in Southern California, there's actually spots like along the Mormon Trail where you have like much larger communities. So we moved from Northern California to Southern California at one point, and through my youth, actually, I was in Southern California with a pretty sizable Mormon community, one of the larger ones that you could actually be in outside of the Morador.
Okay.
So yeah.
So you said your family, they were quite traditional in some way, sort of like
Yeah.
sort of Mormons, but also maybe a little bit more nuanced or open, a bit of Hubie Brown.
Right. So I mean, the we went to church on Sundays, but that didn't mean that the baseball or the football wasn't also on later in the evenings, kind of a thing, right?
Especially if it's a big important match. Like, come on.
Right. So it was kind of that blend of, we had aspects where it was very devout, very solid, and other parts where it was maybe a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more liberal. But I grew up with like a very, whether or not it was imposed on me, I had a very literal belief in the historicity of the Book of Mormon, in particular. That was I took really to the Book of Mormon very well. It became a very like important part of like my developing sense of self. My writing to this day is still impacted by reading the Book of Mormon so much. I think if you read my really long comments, you can actually see that like there's some like touches of like little Book of Mormon style flourishes that I put in.
Are you saying there might be some chiasmus or Hebraisms in there?
I'm not suggesting that that's what's going on, but you may see me doing some of the mini ands, maybe a little bit more of that.
Hebraisms, I love
it. Yeah, a lot of kind of like the repetition of like points. It's like, and this is this, so that means that it's that, and
and you're like, barely, I send to you, Murph.
Pretty much, like woe unto those who, yeah. No, so I do notice that there are times where my own writing style is in fact impacted by reading the Book of Mormon so much, and a lot of my worldview continues to be influenced by the Book of Mormon, despite some of the things we'll talk about later coming in. So, yeah, I developed that. There were times where I was the most active person in my family as well. If I were doing a conversation with John DeLynn, we would be talking about scrupulosity and my upbringing and all of that, and whether or not that was playing a role.
So you were the Nephi of the family.
There were times where I was the Nephi, and I was probably just as annoying as Nephi sometimes with that.
Yeah, like to be fair, as I read the account, and whenever I grew up in primary, I always related more with Liam and Lemuel, right? And I was like, if I had a brother like Nephi, I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna kill him.
My mom honestly had like the same attitude about Nephi. She's like, he's just kind of a punk. He's just really like
goody. So, I will go and do the things the Lord has commanded. I know that He prepares a way. Like, shut up, Nephi.
My brothers who saw an angel. Yeah, no, it was.
And how many siblings did you have? And where did you fall?
Yeah, so I'm my mom's only child. I have 3 stepbrothers, and then my dad had another child, and so I have another sibling that way. My dad's side is not members of the church, but I didn't grow up with that side of the family, so it was really like my 2 sides of the family I really picture from like my mom's parents, as opposed to it being like my own parents being those 2 sides. Anyway, and then I have 3 stepbrothers, and I am in the middle. So the middle child of those 3, I'm like 3 months younger than. So we were a lot of like little, sibling rivalries and all of that kind of came from that, because we were so close in age and we're often going through like a lot of the same life experiences. And again, I was being kind of the bratty Nephi at times of the group. So, you can imagine that sometimes created some conflicts that may not have been the best way of handling the situations. But
So what were your church experiences like before maybe we talk about like what you feel like your testimony was like? What was like your experiences going to like primary? I assume you were baptized at 8.
Yes.
At 12, got the Aaronic priesthood and went to men's and seminary. What was just your church experience, activities, those sorts of things like?
Yeah. So there was definitely like, phases of intermittent activity. There were times where we were a bit less active, times where we were more active, but always believing. It was just it was hard to wake up for church at some weeks. It's like, especially like when church started at 9 a.m., our activity kind of tended to go down a little bit because we're not morning people.
That usually happens if there's 2 wards that meet at the same building. So one's usually in the afternoon. Is that right?
And we had 3 wards meeting in our buildings usually. So you can imagine just how complicated those that scheduling would really get.
And they probably rotate or alternate every year or so.
Right,
Time you
right.
have. Okay, I see.
Yeah, so you would do 1 year at 9, another year at 11, and then another year at 1. And this was back in the days of 3-hour church, the dark ages. And
Well, I can remember on my mission, one area we served in, we had two wards, and it was 3 hour church, and we were at one ward from like 9 until 12, but then we also went to ward council. So I think it was from like 7:30 in the morning, and then the other ward from like 1 till 4, and it was a long, long day.
yeah, yeah. I was in one of those areas as well on my mission where there were 3 wards that met in the building, and we were over all of them. And yeah, it was
My goodness.
whew, yeah,
But anyway,
long Sundays.
back to the question of your church life and church experiences.
Yeah, so what I will say is that especially when I got into like the young men's program, I had amazing young men's leaders. I when I started to kind of go through my faith deconstruction, I did a little bit of blogging for a while, and I still have on that blog an article just talking very highly of those leaders because they really were fantastic. I can't say enough praises about my young men's leaders. And if they do decide to listen to this, which I kind of hope they do, I'll make sure that they have links and all that and know that I'm doing this. Like, again, you guys were amazing. And like really one of the highlights of my youth, my childhood. Yeah, just great folks who really did a lot for me growing up that way. So I mean, I have a lot of positive things to say about that kind of group. And my peers in those groups, my teachers group, my priest group, like I would not go back for a high school reunion. I have no interest in going back to that group. But if we were to do like a priest quorum reunion, I'd be there in a heartbeat. Like I would pay for the plane ticket to fly from Europe to the States to do something like that because it was just a great group of friends, a great group of guys who yeah, just like we enjoyed being in each other's company and doing things. And I don't much care for camping, but like if I was camping with like those guys, like it was actually worth doing. So yeah, with back when scouting was attached to it, I don't know what they're doing these days, but
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
So
So
did you go to like EF? Did they have EFY when you were in youth, or did you go to like scouting stuff and
yeah,
conventions?
so EFY was never really my jam. I was never interested in doing something like that. It just seemed like a lot of being extra social in a way I didn't want to be. Um, um, and I've always been bad about like not really caring much for Provo and being in Provo or anything like that. And since most of the EFY events were held there, it just wasn't going to that wasn't going to work for me either. So
That's quite a long trip.
yeah, but doing stuff like high adventure trips back when we did that, that was fun. And I'm sorry if my microphone is picking up the dog whining.
No, it's okay. I don't notice.
But yeah, so like I would do stuff like that every once in a while. I did that only a couple of times. My teenage years were pretty rough for other reasons that where the church was actually kind of my escape. I had perfect attendance in seminary despite not being a morning person for like 2 years because the church in a lot of ways was my escape. It was that safe place for me to go. And so like, yeah, it served that purpose well. And the members that were in that area were just fantastic. And like I said, my youth leaders were fantastic and can't speak highly enough of that particular group. So yeah,
That's awesome.
we're setting the stage for if you've read my comments, you might wonder how we got there. But
Yeah. So at least socially, it seems like you had a great social experience.
yeah.
Great church community. How would you have described you sort of said you saw yourself a bit like a righteous Nephi growing up. Did you feel like you had a testimony or any spiritual experiences? How would you describe like your, experiences with prayer, studying the scriptures? You said you went to seminary a lot. Just talk about what you felt like your testimony was like in your youth.
Yeah, so that I would go through waves, but at my peaks, I would study like the scriptures every day. I would pray every day. I would regularly attend church. There was a point in time where I was not active. I wasn't going to church. I wasn't really studying. And then a friend of mine was like, "Why not?" And I was like, "Well, like nobody else is going. I don't really have a ride." And so it's like, if I gave you a ride, would you come to church? And like, yeah. And from there, I was going like every week and doing doing the stuff and the prayer and the scripture study. There was a time where we had a family home evening lesson where we talked about the role of Jesus Christ in the plan of salvation, and we sang. I think we were saying, "I know that my Redeemer lives" as the closing hymn, and I remember just like feeling what I would call at the time like the feeling of the Spirit very strongly. Yeah, it was like one of like the moments that gave me like my testimony of Jesus Christ and his role as the savior. And that testimony did last for a very long time. When we talk about my deconstruction, that is one of the last pillars that kind of broke down in that process. Because yeah, I did have like very meaningful experiences with that really mattered to me personally. And then, like I mentioned, I mean, the Book of Mormon has always kind of had a special place for me. And it very much like how I understood my role in the world as a child of God, like was very much defined by my understanding and my relationship with the Book of Mormon. So I really say that's kind of what I was leaning on. Yeah, I think that helps to kind of set a little bit in kind of the picture for what will come into the deconstruction. But yeah, that was a lot of where my testimony was at. And as I got ready for my mission, especially like I was deep into things. I was reading from the scriptures. I was studying like everything that I could at the time. This was a little bit before. It was before the CES letter came out. It was, and kind of before a lot of the internet dialogue between apologists and critics kind of hit the mainstream of YouTube and social media and all of that. So that may have been a blessing, as it were, for my mission preparation. But
so that was one question I was going to ask prior to you going on your mission, and we'll talk about your mission in a moment. You said that you're reading lots of books. Were you reading any books that might have fallen more under like the scholarly side versus like devotional or books about the gospel or doctrine?
Most of everything that I was reading was more on the devotional side. So I read like Stephen Robinson, Believing Christ, right? Like that was a great read for me. But before the mission, I'm trying to think of anything that I would have read that got close to scholarly, and there's nothing really at that scale that I would have picked up on.
And no exposure to any criticisms or sort of anti-Mormon material?
I was exposed to criticisms, and my leaders actually did a good job of bringing up criticisms and kind of doing that.
Like inoculation.
What's the word? Inoculation. Thank you. They're doing the inoculation for it. So you've had your series on like masonry in the temple, and by the time I was going to the temple, because I had seen like History Channel specials and I already knew about like the influence of masonry on the temple and had like that inoculation from it, I was recognizing, certain tokens from those like documentaries on Masons. And when things were explained at the Veil, there are things that I was recognizing from that. And all of that had to do a lot with like the preparation. And it wasn't anything that troubled me because of frankly, because of how open those conversations were.
So did you feel like they were quite informed, your young man's leaders, and quite open when it came to like historical things?
They were informed for the time, for what that milieu was. Again, this is before Gospel Topics. This was before anything like that had come out. And I mean, some of them definitely are informed, definitely know their stuff, and maybe all of them do now. At the time, I think that they were informed and gave information the best that they could based off of like kind of the information that was readily available to your typical more studied member of the church, but not necessarily somebody who was really diving in deep.
I see. Yeah.
If you know what I mean.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so I would like hang out and talk with like the institute director about things like all the time, but we weren't necessarily diving, that's I hadn't heard of like Fawn Brody.
Yeah.
Really, like the reason why I heard about Fawn Brody was because of a US history teacher at a college who did a thing that he really shouldn't have done, and tried to get me to read No Man Knows My History, despite like anyway, that was kind of as close as I ever got to that. If that teacher had handled that situation in a way that was more, frankly, ethical, I probably would have ended up reading No Man Knows My History as part of like that course, and maybe learning a little bit that I don't think would have been faith destroying for me because of kind of how I was approaching Mormonism,
Mm.
but that at least would have been more scholarly and more informative. Um, yeah.
Okay. So you got your mission call. What year was that? Where did you serve?
Yeah,
And just tell us about your mission.
yeah, 2011. I reported to the MTC on April 6th.
Oh, an important date.
Very important
Wow.
date, right? So clearly one of the chosen ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I served in the Texas Dallas mission, and I was Spanish speaking, and the the mission age changed while I was in the field, and so my mission was actually short. Excuse me. Yeah, so the mission age changed while I was in the field. So the period of service went from being what is it, 105 weeks down to 104 for me. So I technically served a shorter mission. So
Lucky.
that might explain everything.
Yeah, I thought if you had just stayed an extra week,
If I had
you
just
would have
stayed
been
that extra
apologist, my
week,
friend.
yeah.
So
uh,
the age change happened 2012-ish. I always had in my head it happened like just before I went
it
in my
happened
mission, but it was a couple of years before.
I want to say it was October 2012 when it was announced at General Conference,
Oh,
and they
okay.
were implementing it then. And by April of 2013, they had done a lot to like do the transition to get new missionaries or to get the younger missionaries out, but that meant shortening the MTC stay for a lot of folks.
Right.
So,
And for anyone who don't know, it was reducing that young men could go at 18 on their missions. It was 19 before, and then young women could go at 19 as opposed to 21. That's my understanding.
right, and not only did it change the ages that way, which is exactly how you got it exactly right there. It also took the MTC period, the Mission Training Center period, from 3 weeks for like
Okay. Right. We'll resume, and hopefully that doesn't happen again.
yeah. I keep trying to talk about this them changing the time you're at the MTC for native language speakers. It used to be 3 weeks. They reduced it down to two. Um, And then for foreign language, it used to be nine, even for like the same alphabet. So for like if you were learning Spanish, it would used to be nine, but they reduced it down to six.
Okay.
Um,
And then it's longer
and
if you're learning like Mandarin or
which
something
went
like
down
that.
from 12 to 9, if I recall correctly.
Okay.
So yeah, that affected the whole schedule for mission transfers, and our mission ended up getting it chopped down by a week. We had one transfer that was just 5 weeks long, and then yeah, for you just kind of went home on your at the end of your regular transfer, right? So
How was
yeah,
your MTC experience and learning a foreign language?
I hated the MTC.
Really? In
I'll be
Provo. This is Provo.
yeah, it was in Provo. I hated the MTC.
Why?
Um, just I didn't sign up to be a missionary to sit in a room with a bunch of people and have like these evangelical, or what's the, I'm not evangelical is not the word, but to have like these like sermons, these revival experiences basically. I didn't
Did you
go
not love all the investigators that you committed to baptism and you
at
thought you
the
were the best
at the
teacher ever?
MTC. Yeah, no, I hated it. I hated it. I couldn't wait to get to the field. I was so excited to get to the field. So I was in a district, Spanish speaking district, but I had been studying Spanish on my own, um, and I had actually gotten pretty good. And I was just bored. I was bored for the language learning, and I was I was bored of the MTC. I just did not like it there. So I asked to be bumped into another district so I could get out earlier. My mission president approved that. So I was able to be transferred into another district and come in halfway through a transfer and just kind of hit the ground running that way. Yeah, no, I hated being at the MTC. Got strep throat while I was there, and like, oh man, get me out of here.
Like, there are missionaries. Even whenever I was at the MTC, I actually personally had a really great experience. I love my district, and I just love the whole MTC experience. But there are other missionaries who they came out at the same time, but they weren't in my district, and they just felt like, I'm trapped in this prison. I'm miserable. I feel depressed. I just want to get out in the field. Whereas, like, to me, I don't know, I just love it. I thought it was such a spiritual environment. It kind of pumped me up, and I felt enthused. And I was like, man, I'm such a good teacher. All my investigators are getting baptized. Changed when I got out to the field.
Yeah, no, it just, I was one like the other group. I was the group that was just like, nope, this is not working for me. Get me into the field. And I want my investigators to tell me no. I want my investigators to challenge me. I want them to, that was what I was looking for. Softballs. I wanted to be Dan Welch, just standing out there and, that was the goal. Not sitting at the MTC and having that. That said, I did get to shake Neil Anderson's hand at one point. So that was, exciting.
And you get well fed at the MTC. You get well fed.
Like, the problem was, like, I've always been kind of peckish, and so when it came to the MTC constant buffet, it actually like meant that I was eating less because I would just get so full that I could never actually like get to the point of like properly eating. Right. It was rough. It was a rough 6 weeks for me.
How was it when you got to the field? You said you were in Texas. I know that's.
So it was hot.
The Bible Belt. Yeah, a lot of Baptists there.
Yeah. I loved it though. It was fun. Texas is a special place, and I, for the most part, being in the mission field was a lot of fun. I, especially my first 6 months and my last 6 months. The middle year, I definitely was suffering from some like mental health issues and all of that that I hadn't really experienced before and kind of was in denial of. I wasn't necessarily at the point that I was wanting to be at with things. But the first 6 months, the last 6 months were awesome. And yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. Overall, I have mixed feelings on the mission now. Looking back on it, where there are parts of me that are like, I'm very grateful for a lot of the things that I learned, a lot of the empathy that I gained, a lot of learning to care for people who come from circumstances that are completely different from my own, that maybe would have been harder for me to develop without the mission experience. I'm not sure that I would hold the values that I do today were it not for the mission. On the other hand, yeah, there were some things that kind of sucked. Missions are hard. And there's a certain kind of colonialist aspect to the whole like evangelical principle and the way that it's been applied by modern Christians, and the whole mission trip experience thing. That's a little bit kind of it. When you get to the point of thinking maybe we can be helping people in other ways, and maybe the mission isn't the best way to be evangelizing or to being that light on the hill.
Did you feel like did you get into a lot of like Bible bashes?
Oh, I love Bible bashing. I baptized decently well. I wasn't like, my role was, I got transferred a bunch. I was transferred like 8 different areas.
You were the bad companion then.
That's apparently. But what I would do is like, I would go into these areas. There'd be these investigators who were like, I'm not sure if I want to get baptized or not. And I'd be like, okay, this is why you're going to get baptized. And then they would get baptized. That was like my role. And then I would leave. And then that was it, And like there are 2 areas that constitute about half of my mission, and then like the other 6 areas, the whole thing was just me like popping in, baptizing this one family, this one person, and then leaving. So from that perspective, I had quite a few baptisms. It's a little bit easier to baptize people from the Hispanic community in Texas. They're in circumstances that make them a little bit more amenable to that message.
More humble or more open in some ways.
However it is that you want to put that, but yeah, right. they're a little bit more amenable to the message, and really wonderful people. Like, and yeah, just I gained a lot of empathy for people in those circumstances, and they're really valuable lessons for me personally. But yeah,
at the time, did you feel like your mission sort of solidified your testimony or your conversion? Were there any doubts or any faith challenges, or overall was it a testimony building experience?
So it's funny because I would say that most of the seeds of my deconstruction were planted in my mission. Most of the meaningful seeds were planted during my mission. But I walked away from the mission with kind of a renewed or full faith in the gospel. But at the same time, because I was taking things so seriously, it's not relevant necessarily to my deconstruction story, but I think it kind of helps to illustrate how I was approaching the gospel in the Book of Mormon. There's a passage in Ether, chapter 3, where the brother of Jared, right, he goes up to the mountain, he's praying because they need to get the lights, or they need to get their situation resolved for the barges, right? And they've got the window for air, they've got and the stoppers for that. They've got the Lord blowing the wind, so that way it'll push them in the direction that they need to go. So they've got their direction figured out. And what they need now is they need light. They need to get that situation figured out. So he's got the rocks. He goes up there, sees the finger of the Lord touching the rocks, and then he's like, "Oh wow, what was that?" And then he's able to see this vision of Jesus Christ. Right? He appears, says, "I'm Jesus Christ," and then he says, "This is the first time that I have shown myself unto man." The problem that I had with that, and the question that I had with that, is that we know that the Lord walked with Adam in the Garden of Eden. We know that the Lord appeared to Enoch, and we know that the Lord appeared to Noah. These are things that are in the other canon of scriptures, and all of those events would have happened before with the brother of Jared. So what's going on? Like, I took this question up to my mission president, and all that. I'm like, this is not faith destroying for me, but this seems to be like a contradiction. Like, what am I missing here?
Yeah, it's a genuine question.
Right. And the best answer that I found to that, I think it was like Elder Packer, who said basically like this was the first time that the Lord appeared as Jesus Christ. And I wasn't satisfied with that answer, frankly. I didn't find that to be a terribly convincing response. Because it was like, I don't think it's going to be written on the plates as like Jesus Christ. Like, I don't think that what Ether in his abridgment of the record of the brother of Jared wrote on the plates, and then Moreau and I are bridging that down. I don't think that said Jesus Christ. I think that said, like God's name at that point. It probably said like Adonai or something like that there instead, because that's who was in that role. So it doesn't make sense to me that that's what it would say. But okay, like fine, put that on the shelf, I guess. In as much as that was an adequate metaphor. But yeah, I was taking it very seriously, having like these very serious like conversations and really trying to dive in and understand the Book of Mormon with what it was saying and all of that. But I think in terms of like really getting into what would lead into my deconstruction, there is a passage in Doctrine and Covenants. I want to say it's in section 128, where they talk about baptisms for the dead. And there's this line in there that says that if the saints do not perform baptisms for the dead according to like the way the Lord has instructed, they will be rejected as a church. And this is like one of the first times where I was encountering in scripture this concept of the church could be rejected by the Lord. There are certain conditions under which the church could go from being the true and living church to not. There is some kind of fail condition.
Christ movement that they argue that's what's happened.
To learn afterwards that there are like multiple movements that are effectively making that argument as well at like different times in history is quite fascinating. But yeah, this is like the first time I'm encountering that. I'm encountering this like natively, right? It's just like over the course of my own studies, and I'm making notes about that. it's not affecting my testimony because, like the church is true, everything, like I've got all this other witness of that. That's great. That's holding for me. But the seed is there, right? That's one of the seeds that's going to sprout. And then another important seed is that started checking out other churches because I wanted to see how my investigators were learning. I wanted to understand how it was that they were taught these spiritual lessons. And during the course of all of this, I see this church called the Church of Jesus Christ. And I know from the Book of Mormon that the Christ Church would be called after his name. And I had been telling people for about a year and a half at that point that if a church is called the Church of Jesus Christ, you should probably be investigating whether or not it actually is the church that belongs to Christ. Like that is something that you should be asking Christ about to see that if it is his church. And you need to know, you can't be drawing from an empty well. You have to know what it is you're looking at. So all right, we got to check this out. So we go in, turns out that it's a restoration branch that had broken off from the RLDS movement. I think at about the time that they had become Community of Christ. If I recall correctly, I lacked the vocabulary at the time to really talk to these people about their experience with Mormonism, with their brand of Mormonism. And if I were to talk to them today, I'd have a completely different conversation. But at the time, this was this is one of my first real experiences with somebody in another vein of the Restoration movement. And when I hear them talking about the priesthood and all that, using this language in what looked like a typical Protestant church, it's just almost this surreal experience for me.
It was a different looking church or building, but it sounded somewhat similar in things that they were saying and teaching.
It felt like I was sitting in a fasted testimony meeting, but there's a big cross at the other end of the room, right? It was just what is this? It was surreal. It was a very very unique experience for me. But that produced the question of, okay, if I know the Book of Mormon is true, what I've been telling people is that the way that you know the church is true is that you have the Book of Mormon, you read and pray about it. If the Book of Mormon is true, that means Joseph Smith was a prophet, chosen by God to be the prophet. And if he's the prophet, then that means that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the true and living church on the earth today. But that experience pointed out to me, there's a gap in that. There's a huge Brigham Young-sized gap in that particular.
I guess it's actually a non-sequitur. It doesn't actually follow, because even if the Book of Mormon is true and Joseph Smith was a prophet, it doesn't therefore mean the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the right church, because there's so many different break-off groups that came from the succession, and then break-off groups from, like you said, the LDS church and such.
Nailed it, right? And I'm just beginning with this, and I would get even more nuanced with that particular point now if I really wanted to drive into that.
And I would make the same arguments as well, because it's in the introduction of the Book of Mormon, so I would have said the same thing. I was probably aware of the RLDS church, but that was about it.
Yeah,
so I thought we're the only church that really came from Joseph Smith.
Yeah, like you, I was no, it's there. I know that there are these other break-off movements, but
polygamists.
This is we're the right ones. Right. we're definitely it. But I hadn't really confronted that before. I hadn't really considered that reality because I'd never talked to somebody from that particular vein of. They probably wouldn't use the term either, but vein of Mormonism. I typically, when I use that term, maybe I use it a lot like you do, where I'm talking about the movement broadly. The restoration movement is that. If I'm talking about the individual church, I'll try to use whatever name it is they're actually using.
The restoration is like Steve Heinecker says. Right.
That's a great way of putting it. But yeah, this was my first time really confronting that, and I was able to kind of land on, I don't really have a good basis for saying that Brigham Young was the rightful successor. I don't know that I really have some the fruits of Brigham Young to be able to test directly for that. But there is this Thomas S. Monson guy. I like what he's got to say. I feel like he's a prophet. So I'm going to go ahead and run with that. And I kind of put that idea onto a shelf otherwise, because it didn't really have a good basis for dealing with the succession crisis in and of itself. But at the very least, as long as the church today was good, as long as I could hold to that position, then it would seem that everything else would kind of fall. That seemed to be like kind of the fruits of the gospel that would allow me to continue holding the conclusion that I'd run into.
I see.
Yeah, so that those are kind of I would say those are the biggest elements of my mission that would lead into my later deconstruction.
And did you feel at the time on your mission, did you feel like these were just intellectual questions? Did you feel like they were almost causing a little bit of doubt? And did you feel like you came home from your mission feeling like, I know the church and the gospel is true? Or was there a little bit of like uncertainty?
I would have still at the end of my mission come home and said, I know with capital K, I know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the true and living church on the earth. Like I would have been with like full conviction of that still, and really believed it and really felt it. Like not just saying the words, but really felt it. Right. Even then, these questions were there. I mean, these are issues. I know that they're there, but these things have answers, and I just need to be patient, deal with it, and time I will get there. Like everything else that I've struggled with before, I found answers for. I guess there's like one little kind of side mention too. Is like I used to say that I could never really understand how a person could become an atheist, but then I read evangelical apologetics for the Garden of Eden and for the Adam and Eve story, and I was like, oh, I get it now. Now I understand. That's how it happens. But I felt like our tradition has like great answers for understanding like the Adam and Eve story and how it fits into this grand cosmic narrative of like human potential and what we're here for. And that was one of those things where I felt like, okay, the restoration's done that for me. It's been like this benefit for like dealing with like answering these questions way better than I'm seeing from any of these evangelical apologists. And I had every reason in the world at that time to believe that would continue to be the case. It had worked so far.
So before we get to your deconstruction, like you sort of mentioned, you felt like you had the testimony of Jesus Christ. You love the Book of Mormon. You like President Thomas S. Monson. Were there certain things about the church and say like the gospel? Because I think everyone's different. Everyone has like specific things which like really stand out to them. With some it might be like temple ordinances or the plan of salvation or like the first vision and the restoration. Were there any like standout things that like you felt like you just loved or really resonated with you, like with your testimony?
I to this day I still love Mormon cosmology. Particularly like as it comes out of like the King Follett discourse and all of that, like I just love it to pieces. It's cool, it's esoteric, it's like heaven, like the Protestant idea of heaven is so boring to me. And it's completely ruined by like this Mormon cosmology, right? Of just this like divine potential of humanity, that we are gods in embryo. We're in this like this larval state where we are going through like passing through certain gates in order to achieve like some level of cosmic greatness, and we're part of this machine of just absolute cosmic grandeur. Like fascinating to me. I love that. And we had some, potentially blasphemous jokes as missionaries about that too. So, I mean, it was like, I loved it. Like that, the plan of salvation was definitely like something I was vibing with. And this was like, despite like having some family circumstances as well that were maybe not ideal according to the plan of salvation, but still like having a hope in just how spectacular the plan could be and how spectacular it had been promised to be. And dang, was the cosmology cool. Like, I love this idea of like how their worlds are created and all of that, and that this is, it's part of this process. And just really, really fascinating to me. It's to the point that when after my mission, when I was at BYU Idaho, my roommates and I were talking about like, is there anything that would cause you to like lose faith in the church? Like, what would cause you to like not believe? I did not bring up this topic. I want to be very clear. I was not the one to bring this up. It was one of the roommates that brought this up. I think that they're still faithful members of the church. So, and like my response was, if we were to ever meet non-human sapient aliens, that would cause me to lose my faith in the church, because that would mean that this like understanding of our cosmology doesn't work. And I know that like sounds kind of silly to make that like the thing that would do it. but like that's how I understood it, right? Like the plan of salvation is about taking like human beings and transforming them into like deity. So to have like something else, that wouldn't fit the mold, right? So that would be the thing. That's what it would take for me to lose my faith. By the way, is like you have to like defy relativity and and make that happen. Yeah. So that's where I was at least at the end of my mission, was you would have to like break certain laws of physics in order to get me to not believe.
Okay. So you come home for your mission. How was it coming home? You said you went to BYU Idaho. What were you studying? And then talk about what happened next, and then maybe talk about what started your loss of faith, or what issues you had that led to your deconstruction, shall we say.
Yeah. So BYU Idaho, so I went to BYU Idaho to study mechanical engineering. That was pretty much right after I got back from my mission. It was a few months afterwards. I come back full of fervor and all of that, and like the decision to go to a BYU was because of what I felt was a spiritual prompting to attend a school in the BYU system. And so I felt like I was following that. I was making that decision based off of what I felt was spiritual guidance. And in some ways, I would say that's where my relationship with the cultural church started to fray. I don't think so much my testimony in the gospel was starting to really wane while I was at BYU Idaho. But I think that my relationship with like the culture of the church was taking a hit. It was seeing a lot of these like principles at play in this community. I was just like, why are we doing it this way? Like, it just felt very like kind of like judgmental in places. And it wasn't like the reflection of like good, healthy Mormonism that I knew growing up. It was like a different breed of it, and I didn't care for that.
Almost like a little bit pharisaical in that sense, or
in a sense, yeah, in a sense. There was a a teacher of mine who had a pretty crass metaphor for it, but a teacher at BYU Idaho who said this. Mormons are a lot like manure. If you put them, you kind of spread them out in a field in a big wide place, like it makes everything green a little bit better. It makes it a lot prettier. But if you pile them up in one place, it just smells like crap. Like, and that's what BYU Idaho felt like.
I'm guessing you were going to institute and stuff.
So it was BYU Idaho, so it wasn't an institute, right? Like the university was the institute. I was doing religion classes that were required, but I kind of railed against that a little bit. Like, you're taking up some of my credit hours, some of my paid study time, and forcing me to do like basically what should just be institute. Like, this is annoying me. I can't use these credits for anything, and all that. This is all like institution stuff. But yeah, it kind of felt like a kind of a poor reflection of the culture. BYU Idaho also has like the rules about like not wearing shorts on campus. At least they did. I think that they still have that rule. And then there's the beard. Yeah. BYU Provo doesn't have that rule, but BYU Idaho, at least when I was there, did. I have not heard about any changes. No shorts, unless they're like the gym shorts that are specifically like university gym shorts, and you're going to the gym. Yeah. And capris weren't allowed. Not that I wanted to wear capris. I don't think I have the legs for it. But yeah, those aren't allowed either. It's weird. It's just this odd culture. Then the beard rule thing just annoyed me to no end. Yeah, as a fellow beard grower, you can probably appreciate just being annoyed with the church culture around beards. Yeah. I get it. You didn't like the hippie movement. Let's move on.
Ironic as Jesus had a beard.
Right. Anyway. It's like Jesus and Brigham Young would not have been allowed to attend the university then. Yeah. So I was definitely annoyed with like a lot of those aspects while I was there. But after my graduation, I moved to Utah. I was in the Salt Lake area, and I think it was kind of when I got into Utah that I started to deal with some of the deconstruction issues. And those came from a handful of different directions, kind of at the same time. So for one, the one thing that I haven't mentioned is that like I'm gay and I knew about that from a long time. So the reason why I haven't brought it up before this point is because in effect, it's not really relevant to the story until now, because I was so deep in the closet that I was closeted to myself. Like I refused to even like deal with it. And
So
like
obviously nobody knew, like your family or leaders
I
honestly
so
suspected.
people might have suspected, I suppose. I didn't really show any interest in girls, but to the point that we were watching a Bruce Lee movie at one point. I think it was Enter the Dragon, and there's a scene where a woman like exposes her breasts, and it was like the first time that I had seen that, and I was like, oh, I don't want to see that. What a good Mormon boy I am. Like I'm not even interested in this. Like this is like how I'm like justifying this in my head.
Virtue
It's like,
garnishes my thoughts at all times.
yeah, virtue at all times. I am such a good Nephi. Um, and like, but recontextualizing that like years later, okay, no, this makes a lot more sense that that's not what was going on. I just wasn't interested in that particular body type.
Right.
And it life kind of got to a head with that, where I was getting to the point where I had to deal with, like, I had to acknowledge what I was going through that way. I couldn't stay closeted to myself any longer. But part of the reason why I stayed closeted so long is because I recognized from like the time that I kind of had the realization of that part of my identity that that would be incompatible with remaining a member of the church, that these lines in the sand have been drawn. They weren't drawn by me. I'm not the one that, made those particular ones. I'm not the one who, said the rhetoric about Proposition 8 in California. I was there during Proposition 8 in California. I'm not the one who made those statements, right? Like I'm not the one who was making the rhetorical lines against same-sex marriage, against gay relationships or anything like that. That was made above my level. So to accept the one would mean rejecting the other, and I didn't want to do that. Kind of not on either end, to be honest. But it just seemed like that was going to be the case.
Did you sort of hope, or like, were you hoping that you would have enough faith that maybe this problem would go away? Or
I was hoping I was bisexual.
Right.
Like I was hoping that I was bisexual. That was what I was like dealing with. It was like, oh man, if I'm bi, then I don't have to confront it. I don't have to deal with this. If I can at least be attracted to girls, to any girl, then I don't have to deal with that. But yeah, that wouldn't come to be. There are some kind of funny stories in hindsight about going through all of that. But so changing your mind about anything is an inherently emotional experience, and then you backfill it with rational justifications later on. You make an emotional appeal at first. So how much of my experience with this is about that? I don't know. The other thing that was going on though, and I want to be a little bit careful about this because I don't want people to be complaining about politics on your channel, but it is an important part to bring up. So I grew up, really believing in the Book of Mormon, really believing the literal stuff. And thanks to the work of Dr. Matthew Harris, I've come to realize that a lot of my politics growing up were very influenced by Ezra Taft Benson, like very, very influenced by Ezra Benson. I really latched on to his Book of Mormon ideas and how it related to the destiny of the United States and all of that. So when in 2015, 2016, we start getting Trumpism emerging into into the Republican space and all of that, that was coming to heads with a lot of like my kind of Bensonite ideas about politics and all of that. And on that side of things, there was a lot of stuff being said about undocumented immigrants that I knew not to be true, because I, on my mission, had sat down with those people, had sat across with those people, had loved those people, had heard their stories, had listened to them. And like these things just were not lining up. And how I'm hearing things from the church, or from members of the church mostly, but it wasn't even about the church at that point. It's just I had tied in my political beliefs with my religious beliefs. whether or not that's fair to my religious beliefs is definitely one thing, but those things were intertwined. And so as I was deconstructing the one, I was also deconstructing the other, and it just kind of created this vicious circle that way.
Because for a lot of people, their faith, their religion is very much tied with their politics as well.
And I'm not saying that is the way that it should be. But for me, it was. And that was part of that deconstruction, or part of the start of that deconstruction, right? So I was working through, okay, what do I actually believe? What are my actual values on that? And yeah, it's hard to say that there's like any one particular inciting incident, because this is a slow process, right? Like we're in 2016 in the timeline here. But I don't feel that there's necessarily anything that's specifically significant, other than like dealing with some issues of like inactivity, because of like my cultural relationship with the church. I had sat down with leaders when I moved into a new ward, and I said, I will accept any calling that you give me. Just don't call me to an activities calling. I know that's going to be bad for my activity in the church. Like, I know how I am. Like, if you really want me to be involved in the ward, call me to a teaching calling. Like, I'll be great in that. Like, I will be like first person in line for that, because I love being engaged in the ward that way. And at first they kind of listened to that. They called me into like the elders quorum presidency and all that. I was participating in that, and that was good.
Was this like a young adult ward?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then after that, they called me into like the family home evening committee. And I was like, okay, well, I've got some questions about your inspiration then. And it's not that I had a bad calling. It's just that I was already kind of at this point of just feeling kind of not comfortable in my own skin. And I knew what kind of an impact that was going to have. And then it had that impact.
Did they frame the call at all, saying like this could be like, say, like an opportunity to like grow or go out of your comfort zone or anything? Of
course, that's what it's always about. It's
right.
Go get out of your comfort zone. It's like I know what you want me to do is to be social. I know that's what you're trying to get at, but this isn't the way to do it. This is like, I'm not posing ill will on or anything on them. Like, this is just them going through like the usual process, but this doesn't feel inspired to me, right? Like, I would recognize, or I felt at the time, like, I'm going to recognize the inspiration. We'll see what the seeds of the inspiration are and all of that. And I tried to be a good contributing member to the family home evening committee, but it definitely wasn't working for me. And then I had some lapses in activity at that point, but when I lapsed in my activity, kind of that last time that I lapsed in activity, it was, I just need a break. I have always come back before. I will continue reading from the Book of Mormon. I will continue to pray. I just need a break. And I did continue to read from the Book of Mormon. And for a while, I did continue to pray. That did start to dwindle after a while. But the last kind of step in this whole process was daily reading of the Book of Mormon.
So would you say up until this point, your issues, you're sort of like, I wouldn't even say maybe you're fully deconstructing this point, but it was sort of more with like things to your sexuality, things with the church, inspiration of leaders. But did you still feel at this time you still believed in the gospel?
Yeah,
like,
if you had
Mormon things.
Yeah, if you had asked me to bear my testimony to the church, I still could have, given you an honest, sincere testimony of the church. I think that my testimony of God was taking a hit. This is kind of the weird thing about going through a deconstruction experience, is that like you'll start to like hold completely incompatible beliefs. And yeah, like my testimony of God is like, I'm not really sure that God exists, but like the Book of Mormon's true. I don't know, like you deal with that by not thinking about it, right? You're going about your daily life. Otherwise, you're just trying to live life. You're just trying to do the best that you can in this world. And when you hear somebody mention something, it's like, oh, maybe I don't really believe that, but you're not dealing with this other thing over here. And that's kind of where I was at.
That's definitely a non sequitur. That definitely does not follow.
Right. It definitely does
not. The Book of Mormon is still true.
But it's one of my favorite ways of illustrating just how like messy deconstruction can be, because like that makes no sense, right? To like hold the one position but not the other. And yet that's
what
where I
was
was
it in
at.
particular with God? Was it issues with like problem of evil and suffering, or was it feeling just very disconnected, calling into question other
Yeah,
experiences? What was
I,
sort of
I think it was
feeling it?
I think it was largely a disconnect. I think that as well, I was starting to kind of stumble into the problem of divine hiddenness, which is an extension of the problem of evil. Um, I think that that's kind of like I wasn't conscious of that. It's like I'm thinking about this and trolling, atheist forums or something like that. And they're like, "Oh, okay, that's like the problem of divine hiddenness." This was, it wasn't that. It was just I
So you weren't really diving
was
into atheism that deeply, but
no,
just
I wasn't touching
personally.
atheist content at the time. Touching atheist content came much, much later and was more a consequence of looking at like anti-JW material. I think like I saw like the Telltale channel with where XJW talking about stuff. I think I thought of that long before I saw any ex-Mormon content. Yeah, it really wasn't like wasn't intellectually necessarily engaging with the question of God's existence, but when people would talk about like God, it was like, I'm not really sure that I vibe with that. I'm not really sure that I'm feeling that resonance with that, more so than anything else. And so maybe that's where some of the emotional side of having your mind changed was starting for me in that experience.
And did you feel like you're calling into question like prior, like spiritual experience? Like you said, like you still, Jesus was one of the last things that you
Yeah.
held on to, but were you reflecting back, feeling like maybe I've never had a close relationship with God or
No, I don't.
everything?
I wasn't doing that. At least not at that point. And I don't think that I would
Okay.
even say that. Yeah, it definitely wasn't at that point. I If we fast forward and we get to about 2019, 2020, early 2020 before the pandemic, um, I had moved to Japan and was definitely living just kind of like, all right, I'm in a place where I can just figure myself out. That wasn't the intention of taking that job. I really wanted to be in Japan. It was like, oh, I want to go on this adventure. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to be fun. I'm going to learn so much. I'm going to all of that. It's kind of hoping to like re-vector and actually kind of get back into feeling like connected to the church.
So you moved
And
there right before COVID hit?
oh my gosh, yeah, I was there in June of 2019.
Oh,
Was when I moved, and I had all these big plans for 2020. I'm going to go to Korea. I'm going to go to Thailand. All this, yeah. Anyway, instead I had a lot of time to meditate, as it were. um, but yeah, that was where I started dating finally. And I was like, oh, okay, this is actually like way better than everything I was trying in the States with trying to follow the church's guidebook. And then and that was where like I think the intellectual side of my deconstruction really started in earnest. And where it got to the point of, okay, I need to know what I believe and why I believe it. And I'd gone through a lot with like deconstructing my beliefs in like the political sphere, and my relationship with the church was definitely strained. I still wanted it to work. Um, but then I started to really wrestle with like the questions of the gospel, really wrestle with like the implications of like gospel or of like the Mormon cosmology, with the meanings of the plan of salvation, what the plan of salvation even had for me in it at that point. And then also started to really wrestle with like with the Book of Mormon and the issues that were there. And I think that you may see like in the comments on your videos, like the ones that I'm the most engaged with, the ones that I'm most specific on, the ones where I'm like making comments that like timestamps are like 30 seconds apart from each other are the Book of Mormon ones, right? Or it's like, okay, well, um, it's definitely been like the issue for me. That's kind of the
very
most
passionate about it.
I care about it. Like,
Yeah.
and I've trying to figure out what my relationship is with the Book of Mormon after a deconstruction has been one of my big passions and my big challenges. I've tried to figure out what my relationship with the church should be after deconstructing, and that's been hard. I still feel I saw missionaries on the bus the other day, or a few weeks ago, I guess at this point, and like I just felt this immediate like care and kinship for them. Like these are my people, and I have a responsibility for them, and I still feel that. And in that same sense, like the Book of Mormon is still a very important text for me. I will, in as much as you can call anything for me at this point scripture, like Mosiah 4 and the injunction about the poor, about caring for the poor and the needy, is scripture for me. It pops into my head as like an indictment of how I react to the poor and the needy, and it's as well as like this like in direction of like what I need to do, but also like for society at large and all of that. Like for me, that is scripture, in as much as anything can be called that, right?
So quick question. So you're saying it's around summer 2019. You've moved to Japan. You're sort of like trying to explore yourself in a way. You sort of stepped away from the church, and is now the time where you're like, I really want to figure out like what if I still believe in this or not. And up until this point, had you looked at like any critical content or any websites? Had that happened prior, or was this more like, I'm going to explore all of this now, and then that's when you explored a lot of like criticisms and scholarship and stuff?
So by about winter of 2019, I think I had seen some stuff from Zelf on the Shelf, Jimmy Snow, handful of other ex-Mormon content creators, and I may have started watching some Mormon stories at that point. I was a lot more interested at that point, really, in analyzing my own religious beliefs through the context of looking at like Jehovah's Witness content, ex evangelical content. So I was spending a lot more time listening to like apologia than I was to Mormon stories at that point.
So like Jeff Durbin and James White and those guys.
So Apologia is he's a Canadian. He does like mostly evangelical content, response to particularly like Answers in Genesis and some other groups like that. Right. And he's got a really interesting hypothesis actually that he's put forward on like a way of understanding the origins of Christianity by taking like the minimum witnesses is what he calls it. He's got a blog entry on Bart Ehrman's blog on that. Actually, it's pretty cool. But long before he was doing that stuff, I was watching like some of his content. And so like some of these names are going to be kind of foreign, I think, to your audience, but just like, no, like these are atheist guys who are like not Richard Dawkins atheists. These are like a lot more like just like chill, a little more hippy dippy, I think, in the way that they kind of approach atheism and
this was predominantly on YouTube.
Predominantly on YouTube. Okay. Yeah, that's my favorite way.
Why are you interested in listening to them sort of like analyzing like Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff at this stage instead of like looking at things about Mormonism?
It was safer. And I think the other thing too is like I was worried about encountering content that unfairly represented the church. I still had this idea that most of the content that was out there that was like anti-Mormon would make an unfair representation of the church. And I will be the first person in the room when, like a Christian apologist like William Lane Craig says something about the LDS church and mischaracterizes our beliefs. And that like, I'm going to be the first one up there standing up defending the church. Like being like, okay, like this, you're being dumb. Sit down. Like I'm going to be that person in the room as well. But the doing that through like J-Dub content was just, it was safer. Like, I don't care if you're going to disparage the Watchtower Society, like say what you want about them. I have no emotional connection to that. It wasn't until I came across Anthony Magnabosco and like the street epistemology. And I don't know if you've seen his video where he talks to like the missionaries and does the street epistemology with them.
Is he the one that was interviewed on Mormon Stories?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I've seen like clips.
He's awesome. Like his channel's great. And all that, like, and honestly, like it's a good method, like kind of like no matter what perspective you want to try to address it from. But when I saw his conversation with the missionaries, it started to kind of open me up a little bit to, okay, there are people out there who can be critical of the church, but treat it very fairly, who can help it to kind of put its best foot forward, and then talk about those cases. And maybe that's the sort of content that I can engage with. And that softened me up a little bit to listening to some other content and then kind of engaging with more of a range. And yeah, that kind of pushed me into everybody has to kind of go through an angry exmo phase. I think when they are going through a deconstruction, that may have been when I kind of hit mine. I had maybe a softer landing than most with it. Definitely made missteps in the way that I communicated and talked with people as I was going through that. I always try to be respectful. But there's stuff like I always try to be respectful. Anything in the temple, under which there's stuff like we take a covenant to not discuss outside of the temple. Anything in the temple, I won't discuss. Those are things that while I may not hold it to the same sacred level as others, I won't discuss. Those are things that while I may not hold that to the same sacred level as others, there are people I care about who do hold that as sacred, who do really care about that. I do think that certain things are fair game, right? Because we're not under covenant to discuss.
I think that's good because I think you don't want to get into the realm of like mocking what people sacred, but you can still like voice criticisms,
exactly,
concerns with beliefs or parts of the belief system.
Right. So I will refer broadly to like the tokens of the priesthood, right? But I'm not going to discuss that with the accompanying names and signs because that is the covenant under which you're not to discuss, right? The new name, I'm not going to talk about my new name outside the temple because I'm under covenant to not discuss it outside of the temple, specifically that. But like the law of chastity and how that's defined in the temple, I think is a very important thing to discuss. If we were to sit down and try to like, I say rather jokingly sometimes, but it's like if I were to sit down and actually do like a temple worthiness interview, like right now, with somebody, like, yeah, I would fail the thought crime stuff. Like I'd fail the stuff about like belief. But then like anything about like actual moral activity, I would say that I pass because in particular, because of how the law of chastity that I covenanted to follow was defined in the temple. That's not my fault that it was defined that way, but because of how it was defined.
I see what you mean.
Yeah, right. And
you find a loophole.
I found the loophole. No, but like it's not my fault that that's how it got defined. Like here it is. That's the way it was written. I'm following it. And it's been changed since because of like the way that the laws of the land have changed. So but I think that that's important to discuss. I think that that is meaningful and impactful for talking about how the theology, how the beliefs of the church move through time and how we engage, those beliefs with each other. But talking about the tokens, there's no reason to do that beyond like a surface level discussion and to say like these are similar to masonry. They're materially similar to masonry, and we can leave it there. Like that's enough for that conversation. If you want to get to some of the historical conversations, there is some stuff that's worth talking about. How Adamic was originally used in the temple is worth talking about because it has like these changes to it, but we're not under covenant to talk about it, right? So
during this time period, would you say the main issues that caused like your loss of faith in, so we say like the foundational truth claims of the church, would you say it was more historical issues, truth claim issues? Was it social issues, or was it a mixture of all of it?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much entirely off of doctrinal issues and social issues. Historical issues play almost no role in my deconstruction. You could have sat here, told me the story of Fanny Alger, and I wouldn't have been like, yeah, okay, that was the church then, but the church today is better. You could have, like, as long as the church today is good, I kind of don't care. I know about the polygamy thing. Polygamy was bad. It was terrible. But if the church today is good, then it's just part of that process. Past racism, right? Like, yeah, it was horrible. And I can be very critical about all of that in that context. But the church today is at least good. It's moving in that direction towards something good, being at force for good. It was evaluating the value of the church in the modern world too, that really played a big role. And that was kind of the thing that I really had to deconstruct more so than anything else, because I did have that image of the church being a net force for good. And while I think that the people of the church are fantastic, I think that the church as an institution does not meet that standard any longer, of, if it ever did, of being a net force for good. And that was kind of the hard part of the deconstruction for me. That was the thing that stung, I think, more than anything else in that whole process. And kind of the thing that I think would have done it for like, okay, this is why I'm now would move into the realm of being disaffected, more so than anything else, because I can maybe work with everything else. And I was trying at the same time. When I came out to my family, which I did just before the pandemic, it was maybe bad timing on my part, but I needed to do it at some point. And, yeah, no time like the present.
You say came out came out about your loss of faith or your sexuality or both?
Sexuality.
Oh, okay.
We talked about faith a little bit in that process, and I effectively made the promise as like I'm going to continue to try and give the church like its best fair shake. I have serious questions, I have serious doubts, I have serious issues that I'm wrestling with, and I'm going to try to treat them as seriously and severely as possible. In a way, engaging with your channel is part of keeping that promise. So I'm actually like when it comes time for me to fawn over your channel and to make you all sorts of uncomfortable with that, that that is one of the things for me that's really meant a lot, is having this place where I can honestly and sincerely engage with another side and really show, I think, what is a good faith attempt to engage with a believing, faithful side of the Mormon tradition, and to really challenge myself as well on, do I have good reasons for holding the positions that I do with respect to this tradition? Or am I off base? I've been wrong before. I consider myself to have been wrong about a lot of things before, right? And had to have deconstructed that. So there's no particular reason for me to think that I'm right now. And
so quick question before maybe we can circle back to your engagement with my channel and other apologetics. Was there a moment where you felt like you lost your faith, or like you went completely inactive, and when did that happen?
Yeah, so people talk about like their shelf breaking moment. I didn't have a shelf breaking moment. I felt like it was more like the screws that hold the shelf, the supports that hold the shelf into the wall kind of slowly came undone, and then it just kind of slid onto the ground. Like that's more of what that experience felt like. It was just this gradual, slow process. To steal the analogy from David A. Bednar, it wasn't like the light switch coming on. It was like the slow sunrise. Like that was more of what my experience was. It was very gradual, and it's not like I can point to all these times, and anytime I tell the story, there are like different things that get emphasized, because it's not any one thing. There's not this particular moment of like, oh yeah, no, that was what really did it. It was just gradual, and eventually it just came together. I could point to like a conversation with a friend where they were like, why do you believe that anymore? And I just didn't have an answer for that. And maybe that was the moment. But it wasn't that either, because by that point I've been spending months recognizing it's like, I don't really believe this. But like it still holds a certain value.
Still held on to for a little bit, like maybe still a belief in Jesus, but stop believing in Joe Smith and the Restoration, or maybe stop believing in the church, but still maybe some divinity to the Book of Mormon.
But if I had to like do like the sequence of it, it was like God was the first thing to go, then like maybe Joseph Smith, maybe the church, those things. Maybe I don't know that one really went without the other. Then the Book of Mormon, and finally was Jesus. But the Book of Mormon and Jesus were so tied together in my like testimony web that it's hard to say which one was kind of the first one to go. They kind of went together because my Jesus was the Jesus of the New Testament, but also the one who showed up in the New World and showed the marks in his hands and in his feet to the people that were there. Like that was my concept of him, of that Savior, was a Savior for the whole world, right? So.
And during this time, were you also exploring, like, maybe still believing in Christianity, or exploring evangelical stuff for the Bible?
Christianity, like, I knew Jimmy Snow has a great saying for this, where it's like, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does a great job of teaching you why all the other churches are not true. I'm like, no, that's a great way of putting it. Like, if this wasn't right, like, none of it was, basically. Or at least I didn't have a reason to think that it was. So by the time I get to the point of like actually recognizing that I have deconstructed all this, and that it's more like I take a sharp turn at that point, there, rather than having a shelf breaking moment, I have a moment of, I need to figure out what I actually believe and why. And so I started from ground zero. I legitimately asked myself, okay, do I believe murder is wrong? Okay, yes, I do believe it's wrong. Why do I believe that it's wrong? Well, because of empathy, I wouldn't want it done to me, or like all these other reasons that we could list for why it's wrong to murder. And I just went from there, right? So I had to reconstruct like this worldview from the ground up.
Right, and your morality as well, and
Right.
sorts of things.
Yeah. So like everything, I started from zero, and I feel like I can justify a little bit better the reasons why I value certain things that I do than I did before. But sometimes my values haven't changed all that much. Like I said, like for the most part, when it comes to things with the church, like I could sit down and you knock out some of the belief questions from the Temple Recommend interview, and I'm going to be able to pass that thing.
Well, I remember listening to, the Stick of Joseph brothers when they were on Mormon Stories. Don't know if you saw the episode, but they're asking John about his morality, and I think he said that still a lot of his values were like a lot of them still came probably from Mormonism, were influenced by that culture.
So around the time that I was really like dealing with the Mormon question specifically in terms of my relationship with the church, I got connected with a group on Facebook called Mormons Building Bridges. And through that group, I got connected with somebody named Evan Smith. And Evan Smith wrote a book as a member of his stake, as a former member of his stake presidency, but still a believer, called Gay LDS Crossroads, that he wrote because his son had come out and had dealt with some suicidal ideation on his mission. Their story, they conveyed their whole story on a Mormon Stories episode, which I like. Honestly, the Smiths are awesome, and all that. Anyway, I got connected with him on that, and he has since left the church. I remember talking with him about that decision when he mentioned that to me. I was like, in a way, I was hoping that you would stay in it, because if you could make it, that meant that like it would be possible to do it. Like if anybody could do it, you could. And so to see you not stay kind of hurts a little bit. But at the same time, it's like I get it and fully respect like what you're doing. But yeah, he in his like leaving the church post mentioned that he identifies as an LDS humanist. And I have since stolen that label because I find that to be a very accurate reflection of where my beliefs and my values come from. I do identify as a humanist in terms of like my ethical framework overall. There's a definite LDS bent to it. I will say that I'm a humanist because I believe in the divine potential of man. I don't believe that in the same way that you believe in that. But I believe in it, that means something different to me. But I do believe that like humanity has like this grand potential that we should be living up to and should be working to live up to. And that's where my values come from in a lot of ways. And that's very much taken from Mormonism. Yeah.
Okay, so I got a couple of questions. So let's see, while you were going through this deconstruction process, what were the main things that you were like the main sources you were turning to? Was it a lot of podcasts? Was it books? Was it websites? Those sorts of things. And then the follow-up question is, were you also engaging around the same time with like apologetic platforms like Fire Mormon or other platforms at the time during this deconstruction period?
Yeah, I kind of in a way you can, if I'm not recommending that anybody go to my blog. Don't go to my blog. Just don't do it. But
okay. When did you start it? And we don't have to link it if you don't want me
to. I started in March of 2020. Nope, June of 2020. Sorry, it was June of 2020 when I actually started writing.
During COVID.
During COVID, needed something to do, right?
In hindsight, I really regret not starting my channel back in COVID. I was like, I had so much free time. What was I thinking?
Yeah, no, like I in some ways I wish I'd done a little bit more, but also like if things were still raw, and so I needed that time for it to cool. Right. You can kind of see some of the track of like how I'm engaging with certain materials at that point. Honestly, through that blog, if I was ever talking about something about the church, I would try my best to give the strongest version of the case that I possibly could. So that meant engaging, and that meant engaging with apologetic sources. But sometimes that meant saying that the apologetic case is actually not the best version of this, and that would mean going to critical sources as well to try and discuss that issue, whatever that issue might be. And it definitely got to the point where I became frustrated with more apologetic sources. And there are times where I'm frustrated with some of the expos as well. Like there are times where you may even see it's like there's been a handful of comments on your channel where I have to be like, okay, look, like that criticism doesn't actually hold because of XYZ reasons. And it's like, yeah, it's like I agree with your conclusion, but the way you're getting there is just it doesn't make sense. You're not quite up to snuff on that one. Yeah, there's been times with that as well. So yeah, I was engaging with podcasts mostly through YouTube because that's my preferred way of getting podcast material. So if your podcast is not available on YouTube, I almost certainly haven't heard it.
Did you say
And
my podcast or
the Royal U podcast? Yeah.
I need to catch up. I have some on like Spotify, but to be honest, I've not really done it in about a year.
The closest that I've gotten to listening to a podcast like off of YouTube was that I listened to about 50 episodes of the Naked Mormonism podcast. But that was after listening to Bryce Blankenagel being on Myth Vision and doing their episodes with Derek on Myth Vision, talking about the history of early Mormonism, which is like a summary basically of the Naked Mormonism stuff. That came later though. That was like probably not until like 2021 maybe that I even heard that stuff. So that's much later in the deconstruction process. But a lot of going through it was just talking to people, just engaging in conversations with folks, and then people would bring up issues, and I would look at what case they're making, look at the apologetic case if there was any available, and go from there. And then as much as possible, just trying to kind of steel man those cases. Eventually, Mormonism Live would come out, and that's been it's been good when they've done some of the more academic stuff. My favorite episodes of Mormon Stories are not the episodes when they're listening to, or when they're talking about somebody's story. For the most part, there are some stories that are really great, but like I love the Robert Rittner episodes. Like that is like just an amazing dive into like the Book of Abraham and the Egyptology associated with it, and it's super super fascinating. I would rather listen to that all day really than like some like the stories episodes.
I would be the same way because I listen to, I would say, probably a few hundred Mormon Stories episodes, like loads, but then after a while I start to get a bit tired of the stories. I'll listen to the occasional one, but it's usually, if I'm with you, I find the ones with scholars most interesting, or truth claim churches for topics generally.
What I found, there's definitely like on the critical side a dearth of having like believing folks available to talk to, or even representing their views accurately or anything like that. Criticisms can be leveled there, but I feel that the apologetic side is more guilty of that generally, of not having their opposition available or really engaging with what their opposition is saying. So we talk about like the case of like Stick of Joseph on Mormon Stories. And we can dissect, do an autopsy on why that conversation fell apart the way that it did, but there is no small part of it that goes to the Stick of Joseph guys went in with a mission to convert John Dehlin back to Mormonism. That was their goal, and they were going to stick to that the whole way through. And John wanted to have a conversation with a couple of apologists about their Mormon story and maybe engage with a few issues and see how they handle it.
They did come on with quite a bit of zeal and some boldness. Like I was kind of like, whoa. I can't remember if I told you this before, but I knew within the first minute or two, I was like, oh, this is not going to be good. This is gonna. I felt the tension building.
I wanted to sit down with the, if I could sit down with them before, I would sit down and I'd open up to Alma 38 and I would, go to like, you use boldness, but not overbearance. Like, let's keep this in mind through this whole conversation, please. Cause you guys,
but yeah, we're here to challenge you and, testifying of Jesus. And in a way, like it was like, what's that quote from? Is it Bane from Batman? He's like, admirable, but I can't remember the rest of it. But misguided or something.
Yeah.
Something like that. I was quoting him.
Yeah, it's like I can appreciate what your objectives were here. I get what you were trying to do, but this wasn't it.
Was admirable but mistaken, I think.
That's a good way of putting it. Whether or not the quote is accurate, that's a good way of putting it.
Fascinating conversation though. I do like the Stick of Joseph guys. I've engaged with Hayden before, But yeah, I think it probably didn't go the way they anticipated. Although I kind of thought, like, did they not maybe anticipate, especially going in with that approach?
Yeah.
But it was interesting because, like John, he has had on like some apologists in the past, like back in his early days. I really enjoyed listening his interviews with Carol Givens or Richard Bushman
Right.
or Brent Gardner. I think he had on Brian Hales. So at the
Yep.
beginning, you would have seen more presence of apologists. Obviously, since his excommunication, there's been less, but you've had like Jim Bennett or Patrick
Yep.
Mason, Rod Meldrum, which was a
Yeah,
completely
that was that
wreck.
was that was one.
And then
But
I think Stick of Juice are probably the last one since Rod Meldrum, I think.
I think that that's accurate. I think that that's accurate. I love the ones with Jim Bennett as well. Like, to be clear, like if I was engaging with apologists, it was Patrick Mason or Jim Bennett, those guys, right, who are definitely more nuanced in their approach.
Right.
I think you would be a great Mormon Stories interview, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Like, because I think you would go in with more of the attitude of sharing that story, and kind of hoping that the story would speak for itself, just the way that you presented.
Cheers.
I think that would be a good one, because I think it would be more in that vein of a Jim Bennett or a Patrick Mason.
Yeah,
And
I've reached out and I'm hoping. I think one day it will happen. It's not happened at this
yeah,
point, but I'm just being patient, and I'm
I
sure
hope
one day it will
so.
come.
I hope so. I hope that I hope they have you on. I think that would be a good interview. Um, yeah. And to be clear, like I've engaged with Jim Bennett on Twitter a few times, where we've had a couple like little back and forths and all that, but nothing but respect for guys like Jim Bennett, and Patrick Mason, and the guys that are kind of in that vein of Mormon apologetics. I yeah, I think that some of the criticisms that are lobbied against that particular brand of apologetics is fair. Um, but I also really appreciate what it is that they're trying to do. And yeah, I
Like
think
they're more engaging, but maybe you feel like
yeah,
it's very nuanced or
if the church was the church described by Patrick Mason or by Jim Bennett, I think there'd be a place for me in it. I think like that's something that I could be a part of. I think that that is a community I could feel proud to engage with in that way and feel comfortable being in. But I think that it's a little bit more the church of I shouldn't name names, but some other individuals, some of which you have had on your channel and some of which you have not, that I think are a
okay.
little bit more actually representative of what the church is like. And from yeah, it's unfortunate in my opinion that that's the way that it is, but it is.
So
And
I want to get your quick thoughts on, because often when people leave the church, and I think apologists, there's a wide range of there's different apologists, as we've kind of been referring, like people like Jim Bennett or Patrick Mason or Terrell Givens, Richard Bushman, who I think are very, very thoughtful, maybe less combative, some might say more nuanced, and there's others with your traditional apologists like
yeah.
your Dan Petersons and stuff. And I kind of like a mixture of both, for me. But some people can be very critical of apologists. I sort of want to get your general take. Obviously, some people might feel like it's either, obviously pseudo scholarship or mental gymnastics, or they can feel like it's very combative and polarizing towards critics. Some might even feel intellectually dishonest or weaselly. Do you think? Do you lean with any of that? Do you think there's fairness to that? Do you think there's more nuance to that? What's sort of like your take to that?
I think there's fairness to that, and I think there's nuance to it. I When I look at a Fair Mormon article, for instance, I really like diving into the sources that they actually post on those sources, or on that, especially when they are citing current research. When we've chatted a little bit, we talked about like if and conditionals. We won't get into like the details on that here, but the paper that informs that particular apologetic, there's one paper that informs it. It's by Royal Skousen, and when you read the actual Skousen article, it is very self-referential, and it doesn't pull from any of the actual like scholarship around like Hebrew, like ancient Hebraisms or anything like that. You don't see anything about like biblical Hebrew being discussed in that in the arguments that are being made. And when you actually read scholarship that is adjacent to that particular question. One, you don't see Skousen referenced in those papers. At least you don't see his case being made about if and conditionals being made in those other papers. And two, they're not even close to really using the language that Skousen is like leaning on. So in that sense, it looks like pseudo scholarship. It's here's this thing that kind of sounds like I can make a case off of. I'm going to make that case because it sounds good. And I'm going to refer, if I'm referring to anybody, I'm referring to myself or to this one other guy and who happens to believe the same thing as me. And then no critical scholar looking at this would come to the same conclusion as me. And that feels problematic to me. So when it's that sort of thing going on, definitely an issue for me. I think some of the historical discussions can get really nuanced and really interesting that way. You've had some people on talking about like the what implement was actually used in the translation of the Book of Mormon. In as much as like when I listen to that, I'm like, okay, how much is this actually like a coherent historical question? But also there's like some really interesting nuance there. And you can take just Dan Vogel's version of it, which I think he makes a good case for. We've got other guys who problematize that, some apologists who make some like really interesting arguments in other ways that I think are a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more interesting.
You're referring to like the Neville and Lucas theory, because that was one topic where I sort of felt like I had come to a conclusion on it, and then I was challenged by reading their book and our interview, and I was like, I just need to, because I don't know if you've watched the episodes I did, but I did like one episode where I read through this book, Opening the Heavens, and it was actually a good book. It had like 200 and something sources on Book of Mormon translation. So I was like, I just read through them all. I highlighted the ones that refer to like translation instruments. And then I wanted to accumulate like the majority of them. It probably doesn't have every source. And then I want to like decide for myself what I think is the most likely interpretation. Because then there's some people who are like, oh no, it's only the Urim and Thummim because that's what Joseph and Oliver and John Whitmer claimed. That was sort of like the official sort of canonized account. But then you've got like people like Emma or David Whitmer, Martin Harris, who refer to a seer stone. There's some accounts that refer to both. So it's kind of like, it's messy, it's kind of complex.
Right. And I think when I'm listening to it, I'm like, okay, so maybe it's just because they're just using confusing language and they end up using the same term for the different things. And so we don't actually know which thing they're talking about. And
there's some that are ambiguous. Like I'm thinking off the top of my head, I think like either Joseph Knight Sr. or Elizabeth Cowdery, they refer to like an interpreter in a hat or a Urim and Thummim. So I was like, are they conflating the seer stone, or were spectacles put in a hat? Like there was a lot of, you could say, ambiguity or messiness when it came to it.
Yeah, and I think that work is interesting. Whether or not it has legs, whether or not it's even a historically meaningful question, I think is still open for discussion. But I'm glad that they did that work. I think that it is. I think it was an interesting contribution to that question. So yeah, I would say I do end up kind of a bit nuanced with it. But I also would say there are some scholars that the instant you reference them, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm not really gonna, I don't care anymore, because like it's been only pseudo scholarship. It's been only like, you're not presenting a point that's actually like found in the data. You have a certain dogma. It has to be this. It's the Dan McClellan lines about this, right? Of like, you're subordinating the data to whatever dogma it is that you're holding, because you hold this position. It has to be this way. And so whatever it takes to make it fit is what you're going to do. And I don't know, maybe you'll present something with like the Book of Abraham when you get to that like really makes it super nuanced for me. I'm like, oh, wow, okay, my paradigm shift. But what I've heard so far is mostly like, we have this problem. We know this is an issue. So now we need to try and problematize it somehow so that way we can wedge in this text as being inspired. And yeah, that gets to the point of being pretty pseudo scholarly for most versions of dealing with that. There's been a handful of them where it's just like, I'm just not like, some of like the most extreme catalyst theory versions of it are like, okay, well, we're not actually even in the realm of like pseudo scholarship. We're just we're just coming up with solutions. Okay, cool.
And I am actually hoping it'll probably be in the new year. It's not happening this year. I know I have to do a series on the Book of Abraham. I do want to make sure that I address some of the the work of like arguments from Robert Rittner and Dan Vogel as well in the Kirtland Egyptian papers, and probably drawing upon LDS discussions. So that's a topic I will have to dive in deep and explore. I think it'll be definitely an interesting and highly controversial one. I'll worry about that in the new year.
I think you're wading into waters there. You've done a really good job overall. I mentioned this before. I've mentioned it in like a lot of my comments. Because of the way that I do my commenting, you could actually see a handful of cases where I'm like, okay, well, you're saying this, but like, what about this question? And then like you'll ask that question right after. I'm like, thanks, Murph. Like, there's been a handful of instances where that's come up. So you've done a really good job, I think, of like at least like of understanding what the critical arguments are, and presenting them fairly. So
do you see that as a criticism in apologetics? Because sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes I felt like that a little bit whenever I've listened to certain faithful channels. I like them, but maybe I felt like they don't steelman the critic's argument as well as they can. And of course, I wouldn't argue the same as a critic.
Yeah.
Do you feel like I at least strive to sort of somewhat fairly represent generally what I think the critics might think?
Yeah, so the reason why your channel has continued to be the one that I go to the most regularly for my apologetic information is because you do fairly represent the critical side, more so than I think any of the other apologists that I've heard. Like, I think in some ways you're like even better than at times than Jim Bennett and Patrick Mason, which is saying something. Because those guys are really good at understanding the critical arguments, presenting them fairly. And there are times where I think you do an even better job. When you went through your deconstruction, you may have, I don't know how much you engaged with like atheist content during that point in time, but you may have heard like a lot of like Christian apologists or Christian preachers who would do the, well, you know, I used to be an atheist, but then I found Jesus. And you like listen to their story and you're like, you were never an atheist. Like, it's so obvious in the way that you talk about this, that you never actually went through a deconstruction. You were just dealing with, you know, like the usual like teenage rebellion stuff or whatever. The way you talk about your deconstruction was very clear to me that you actually have deconstructed, that you've gone through that experience and come out to the other side of it with a different conclusion than I've drawn. But that you went through a sincere deconstruction. Like, you would be pretty solid at deceiving people otherwise if you hadn't gone through that. Like, it's pretty clear that you know, and I don't assume people are deceitful. So like to me, it was very clear that you had actually genuinely, sincerely gone through that. And that resonated with me as like, okay, like if there's somebody who is going to give the fair shake, this would be the channel to do it on. I really wish that more channels would take a page out of your book on that. Because I would like to engage in other spaces, you know, with folks, you know, like it's interesting. I love this stuff. I'm totally passionate about Mormonism. Like, I love Mormonism. I'm critical of it. I'm critical of the church. You know, I've got my issues with that, but like, I love this tradition. It's fun. There's always something new to learn. And like, did you know that there was like another dude who was like on the first presidency randomly in Kirtland from like the end of 1832 to 1833, and then he just disappears off the face of the earth, and I can't remember his name right now. But like, there's just this dude who like they reassigned like the Frederick G. Williams like revelation or to Frederick G. Williams because this guy left the church, or he was excommunicated. Like, what is this? Like, it's just this random stuff that you just find out in history, just, you know, as you're just kind of diving through stuff. And it's exciting, it's interesting, it's you know, you get into like a new conversation with people about things. Like, people will challenge me on I mean, I mentioned if and conditionals. I've read more about like the if conditional or the conditional format structure of like the biblical Hebrew than I ever would have wanted to. I do not care about biblical Hebrew. Like, maybe I should be more interested in actually studying it than I am, but like, I'm not interested in studying it. I've got enough languages in my brain right now. I don't need to add that. But yeah, like, I dive into that because like people will come with this question. It's like, I need to have a good answer to this, and it's interesting. And that's where like a lot of like my approaches to talking to apologists has come from as well. That I think like a lot of believers, I hope that a lot of believers have sincere questions for unbelievers about like, why is it you don't believe? Or why is it like, why isn't this apologetic that I'm making or this particular argument really resonating with the unbelieving person
Well,
that I'm
yeah, why
talking
aren't you
to? You
persuaded
know,
by it?
why, like, this is super persuasive to me. Why is it not to you? And I don't think that a non-believer is under any obligation to actually like get into that. Like, it's, I think that the obligation is enough to say like, look, I just don't find it convincing, and that's fine. But I think it's also really helpful for people to hear like, okay, this is why it isn't convincing, and I've tried to do that as much as possible to say like, I want to understand what your point is, but here's why I don't find it convincing. Here's XYZ reason, and this is may not be the whole reason, but this is why I'm not convinced by the point you're
And
making.
I actually really appreciate that. Like, I appreciate the kind words that you've said because that has been something I've strived to do with the channel while being a believing member, and it probably leaning more like I think there's like a spectrum, right? There's those who are very, very critical of the church, those who are very pro apologetic, and it can be quite polarizing, quite
Mm-hmm.
combative, us versus them. There's some I would say certain critics, maybe like a Dan Vogel or William Davis or even
Mm-hmm.
like ex members like Anthony Miller or yourself who are very thoughtful, more in the middle, but not believing, and then maybe people who are more on the believing side, but they can sort of engage in dialogue. And my hope was like for believing members to watch the channel, at least be aware of the critical arguments, like be exposed to them in a
Mm-hmm.
way, but then to also provide like what I think maybe the best faithful answers or explore the apologetics or evidence which maybe I feel like, say, the LES discussion series, they touched on some apologetics, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe they wouldn't have dived in as deeply as I
Sure.
would in my channel, because that's probably my bias. My
Mm-hmm.
bias is more, I want to emphasize that more. And then their bias is let's focus more on the problems. But I
I
appreciate, or sorry, if you have
No,
something
no,
to
so
say.
I was just going to comment that, like, I think there was one of the, or one or two of the LDS discussions episodes, like, they really just need to have the Murph on. Like, just like, let's just nip this problem, but they need to have him on for this particular episode because I think it would actually enrich the conversation.
I think you said
Uh,
on the one the witnesses,
I
you're
think it
like
was the
it
witnesses.
could have
Yeah.
been you could have been good to have had on there. And I appreciate what you say because on the one hand, I think it's important to engage with the other side because we can often be in those echo chambers
Mm-hmm.
and you can still hold your position, but then sometimes as you engage with someone from the other side, you might realize that maybe this isn't like a smoking gun
Right.
argument, or maybe it's not as strong in evidence as I thought it was. And then you kind of like refine your positions and you sort of maybe better understand the
Yeah.
other side as well, and not necessarily going with the intention to convince each other. I think one of the hard things can be, and I've sort of noticed this as well, is it can be really hard to ask questions, be curious, and try to understand the other person's point of view, their position, almost in a way that people might see it as like, well, am I giving ground? Am I
Mm-hmm.
validating it? And they almost feel like if they're having a conversation between a critic and apologist or an ex-member and somebody who's still in, it's almost like if you show too much understanding, or like, oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's an understandable argument, whichever side it is, people almost feel like, well, I can't be giving ground because then they might
Right.
say, well, you should come into my position. Don't know what you think about
Yeah.
it, but I think that could be a hard thing in this space where that's why I think there still is very much this us versus them.
Yeah, it's Eskimos are just another breed of Mormon, right? You know, it's one of those like still holding to like I have my own dogma now that comes from like my position of not belief and like
Right.
just entrench into that as much as possible. The Book of Mormon absolutely cannot be true. And one of the things that's helped for me on that is going from the okay, like I don't believe in the historicity of the Book of Mormon, which means that like a lot of the truth claims fall apart, but the Book of Mormon can still be scripture for me. And as much as scripture means anything to someone in my position, like the Book of Mormon can still be scripture. So what values can I draw from this text? I can understand all the issues and everything like that, but I can still draw value from it. Why should I allow like these other factors to stop me from finding value and meaning from this text that I have always found valuable. That's the adjective and meaningful. And yeah, like that's been part of my motivation as well in engaging with the space as a critic, maybe somewhat selfishly of just being able to hold on to the value that I have found in Mormonism, and to claim it as my own, instead of it being subordinated to any one particular approach. And so sometimes that means that the way that I've gone about approaching a certain issue or a certain question has to change because, oh, yep. A great example of that is like Reform Egyptian, the no such language argument. If that ever comes up, but if a critic ever brings that up in apologetic space, I'll say like, look, I understand where you're going with this, and I think that you are technically correct. However, the reason why this doesn't hold up is because there's actually a decently sound apologetic that is a correct apologetic. And we can talk about like what that apologetic would mean down the road, but it at least answers this no such language issue.
Right.
Like this
Reformed
particular
is just a modified version of Egyptian.
This particular criticism doesn't actually hold. We need to modify the way that we talk about it because otherwise it's going to be alienating to keep saying no such language.
Yeah, and I think that that's important for both sides to critically examine some of the arguments that we make as well, because sometimes like on the critical side, like you said, certain arguments can be like that, and vice versa. There's maybe certain apologetic arguments in favor people might make that.
The one that will get me more angry, like faster than anything else, is the it just says the Great Tower. It doesn't say that it's the Tower of Babel. If that ever comes up, it enrages me when that particular apologetic comes up. Because like, oh yeah, all the other great towers where the languages were confounded, sure. That one, if an apologist brings it up, just makes me so mad. And yeah, so just to say, like, there are on each sides where I will get upset about like certain.
We'll not have a discussion about the Tower of Babel. Then it will get heated.
I can talk about the Tower of Babel. I mean, we can talk about Babel, but like. We need to deal with like what the Book of Mormon actually says. Like let's take the text seriously. The one thing I respect Heartlanders for more than anything else is that they do tend to take the Book of Mormon seriously, and what it actually says seriously. So we'll say that. But
so I want to ask a couple of questions. One slipped my mind, so maybe we'll come back to. Coming back to your story then.
Yeah.
Did you come out to your family, and when did that happen, and how did they react? And have you had any other family members, leave or anything like that?
Okay, so when you say coming out, we're now using that in the term about like my status with the church.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't have the same coming out journey about that. I think that that's just kind of become implicit. There was a period of time actually where I would get friends that would message me on social media and say like, where are you at with your relationship with the church? Are you like trying to change it from within, or like have you left the church? And I'm like, the fact you're asking me that question means I'm doing what I wanted to be doing. Like that, I have hit the rhetorical goals in my communications on that. Because I've never actually formally left the church, I haven't felt the need to do anything with like actually like coming out. And that I think it's just kind of at this point understood that I'm in a position of being critical. I don't hold the truth claims to be reflected of in reality. And if you want to talk to me about it, like I'm here, like I'd be happy to discuss it anytime. To my awareness, I don't have very many family members that have left. I think pretty much the vast majority of my extended family is still in the church to some extent or another. Maybe one or two people that have it, but it's been a pretty small minority of my family circle. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna ask just a couple of wrapping up questions because we're approaching 2 hours, but this has been a fun discussion. I've enjoyed this.
I've really had a good time.
So, a member might be thinking who's watching this. I don't think this, by the way, but an Orthodox member, they might be thinking like you stepped away from the church, you sort of went through seasons of inactivity, you started to become a bit disillusioned with the church, shall we say. And then, like,
maybe delusioned as well.
yeah, and then of course you would then start to lose your faith in a way, almost like that spiritual fire, spiritual strength.
Sure.
Had you still been really active, wouldn't have then caused you to go down the deconstruction. And they might even say maybe because you left the church at that point, you almost wanted to deconstruct the truth claims at that point. What's your response to that?
So, I mean, there's a little bit of pushback of like, okay, what story would you actually accept as being a valid deconstruction story at that point? I'm sure that random Orthodox member, you've also gone through different waves of like activity or all of that, seasons of strength and seasons of maybe not as strong. We all do. and that's fine. That's part of the experience with it. That's part of the growth experience that we're supposed to go through. But I think that more than anything, my pursuit has been to try to find as much truth as I can, to believe as few false things as I can. Definitely stealing that from somebody else, but that's been a goal, is to pursue truth wherever I can find it. That was when I felt like I was finding that in the church, and that was meaningful for me. It was worth going after. And when it stopped feeling that way, deconstruction served its purpose as well. Yeah, I don't know that you can find any place in my story where there's an indication of like I wanted to deconstruct. Point that out to me. Like I said, it just kind of happened. And you know, there's nothing in this particular story that's outside of like the realm of like normal. This is just what people go through. And I think too, the fact that like I don't know, like look at how I've engaged as well with the apologetic arguments. And if you feel like I've been, again, royal you, because you aren't putting this forward, but if you feel like I haven't been fair to the church or fair to the apologetic arguments, like, or if I'm misrepresenting it, let me know where, because I want to be as fair as possible. I hope that that's come through in the comments that I've made. I try to understand what those arguments are, and sometimes my pushback is I don't think you're making the best argument that you could make from your position. And
I could be a better apologist, you're saying.
Yeah. Again, this is royal you, so I'm not saying the Murph you are doing this. This is right. I would rather I engage in the space for in part because I want the apologetics to be better. Like when I was going through my deconstruction, like I did listen to some of the stuff from like apologists like William Lane Craig. And while I think Craig's arguments are bad, he is a much better apologist than anything that we're producing in our tradition. And that sucks. That sucks to see. I want to see better apologetics. I want us to be doing stuff on par with or better than the Kalam cosmological argument and stuff like that. Like I want to engage with stuff like that, but we're not creating that. We're creating Long Scroll and Catalyst, and I want better. Like that's what I'm hoping to see. So yeah, you could say that.
I appreciate that, because sometimes I find with some of my content, and if I'm being honest, if I were to comment on most people's YouTube videos, I rarely do long engagement. So I appreciate the fact that you engage with my content and you do time codes, that you take it seriously, at least, because I think there's probably a lot of ex-members who don't sort of take it very seriously and just leave a little sort of like flippant comment. So that's what I appreciate. I don't always have time to respond to all the comments. I'm a busy man, but I do tend to read most of them, and I appreciate that you engage with my video a lot.
I'll be honest, sometimes the stuff that I put as comments in yours is so that way I have like future reference points to come back to, because sometimes those conversations are like, oh, I know I responded to that on like the Murph channel before. So now I can just easily extract information for myself. There's a little bit of selfish intent with that is all I will say. But the hope too is like, it's just easier to just say, look, go back to what was referenced here. Am I mischaracterizing what was just said? And now here's the response. And hopefully, like if people are engaging with me on that, which happens from time to time, I love the engagement. So if you see my comments on there, like, and I'm engaging with you, like, just know I'm having fun. Like I am thoroughly enjoying our conversation. Hopefully it never comes across as me being upset that you're challenging my position or anything like that, because I'm having a good time. I thoroughly enjoy these conversations, and
I widely encourage apologists as well to engage with your responses, but all engagement
you're just wanting the engagement on your channel, so I get the views.
So I want to ask this question, two parts to this question. How certain do you feel in sort of like your current beliefs, like say no God, no like Jesus Christ isn't divine, don't believe in the church's truth claims? How certain do you feel in that? Do you feel like then close to 100%? Like more confident than not, plausibly not true, obviously be within that range? And I've got a follow-up after you answer that.
So when it comes to like the question of like God, if you were presenting like a deistic God, I have no way of falsifying that. There could be a God that just set the universe in motion and then left it alone and hasn't touched it since. I have no way of testing that, no way of knowing. And to me, it doesn't seem like a particularly relevant question to actually care about. But if you're starting to talk about like a God of like classical theism, triomni and, you know, all powerful, all knowing, all loving, all of that, that's a God that I don't really believe in. I think that the problem of like divine hiddenness, the problem of evil, those things kind of weigh against that concept of God. A trickster God remains a possibility. Loki could be the ruler of the universe for all I know. I don't know. That makes a certain kind of sense. But as far as like the way that Elohim is constructed in Mormon cosmology, I'm pretty sure that that God doesn't exist. I'm about as sure as I can be of anything. I would, and the way that I would challenge that too is like, look, I'm open to the possibility. I haven't closed off that door, and if God, if he exists, and if he wants me to believe in him, he knows what it would take. He knows what it would take to change my mind. And why isn't he doing that? Why hasn't that been done? And this would be the, you know, the initial free will defense comes up with that usually, and then I like to take that away. I think he knows how to do that in a way in which my free will would remain intact. I'm pretty sure that he's smart enough to figure that out. And I would contend too that my free will, if he does exist, is kind of impeded by not knowing that he's there, because I can't actually rightly choose at that point, because I don't have the adequate information in front of me. Anyway, so with that, that's kind of where I'd stand with that. And when it comes to like the Church's truth claims, I think that kind of falls under the same thing.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of like the historicity of the Book of Mormon, I feel like I can rule it out after First Nephi 4, before we even get into like the Arabia journey. But by Deutero-Isaiah, by the time Deutero-Isaiah is quoted in the narrative, I'm about as confident as I can possibly be that it's ahistorical. That doesn't mean it doesn't have value as scripture for me, but I kind of align with Community of Christ on that at that point, where I don't think it's historical, but I do see like scriptural value in it. And I think that, yeah, it kind of follows all from there.
Okay, so I've got a question about then, like a few things. What would it take you to say, ever believe again in, say, God or Jesus or the Book of Mormon? So like hypothetically, like if we find, say, Bountiful and Zarahemla, would that cause you to consider or maybe believe again in the Book of Mormon? Or if we find the missing portion of the Book of Abraham scroll, Matthew Smith's translation, or if an angel appeared to you, or you had some really like revelatory dream, like what do you think?
I would be less convinced by those last two things actually, because it's more likely that I'm hallucinating. Like it would have to be like, it would have to occur in such a way, for either one of those to actually hold value.
Angel appearing.
Yeah, but if you like found like Zarahemla or Bountiful, and like we could actually like tie it, like show that it is like the city out in the Book of Mormon and all that, like I would definitely do a double take at the very least at that. Like I would definitely be curious and investigate that a little bit further, because yeah, that would be impressive. I am also of the so yeah, when it comes to that, like yeah, I would be like, oh wow, okay. And this would get into like the hypothetical of, okay, if you could convince me that the Book of Mormon is true, great, you've completed a step in this journey. I guess you've got me back into theism, you've got me back into like sort of this like Christian sense with that, because that's entailed in the claim the Book of Mormon is true. But that's all you've accomplished at that point, right? Like we're now having to kind of go from there for like anything about the church's other truth claims and succession
follow
claims.
Up to that, because say if someone holds the view that okay, maybe God won't provide absolute proof for you to believe in it, but say a lot of your biggest issues were disbelieving, if hypothetically a lot of them got resolved, say we find all of the anachronisms there is in the Book of Mormon,
resolved every one of them,
or say things got overturned, so there's not like evidence that proves, but say if a lot of the issues going against started to get overturned, do you think something like that would consider believing again? Or would you, because there's some people it's almost like, what does it take for someone to believe? Do they need for like
Yeah.
plausible evidence, and then a spiritual experience is enough? Do they need every single issue debunked? Do they need absolute proof before they could believe again? What would it take for you?
I would say, I mean, like it would have to get to the point where the truth claims corresponded with reality. I would think. And I could go back to what I said before about like the issues of like divine hiddenness, right? Like God knows if God exists, then God knows what it would take. And that's not being done, obviously, because I don't, right? Like, I don't accept those claims, but God knows what it would take. But outside of that, like really looking at what it would practically take for me, yeah, you definitely have to resolve the anachronisms. No doubt about that. And I would say too, the Book of Mormon would have to start being a thing you could actually make predictions off of, in terms of like things that data that we would find and to lead in that direction. But it's not just the Book of Mormon, like the Bible would have to do the same thing as well, because those things are connected to each other, and that's got its own set of like issues. And yeah, yeah, there are a lot, there's so much that would have to be resolved that it doesn't feel practical. That's in terms of like your belief question. And I think that the more interesting issue would be like, what would it take for me to be like involved in the church again?
Oh yeah,
Because I might not believe in the
one.
church. Sorry, I'm not wanting to be like, you should have asked this question instead. But just kind of going through it, it's like what I think is actually like maybe even more interesting to talk about from like my perspective on that is that I think that the standards for what it would take for me to be involved in the church are different than what it would take for me to believe in it. Because I do feel a draw towards the church. I do feel a draw, like this is my community, these are my people. I see the missionaries out in public, and like I need to protect them. They are my responsibility to care for, right? Like I feel that still in my bones. So in that sense, like the church would need to be good. I think more than anything, I would just need to see that goodness reflected. So if I've got a call to action for the church, I mean, at the very least, let's like house every person in Utah. Let's start there. Like you can do that right now. You have the resources to do it. And there being a single unhoused person on the streets of Salt Lake City is just an absolute crime. It's a crime against like the very teachings of the Book of Mormon. So let's start there. And we've got work to do. We've got a lot of work to do. But if the church became like that net force for good in the world, even if I don't believe it, like I would want to be a part. I would want to be affiliated with it because it would be meeting like those standards and its potential.
The church gave $100 billion in humanitarian aid around the world to help.
I'm thinking about getting involved in the church again. I don't know if I'm going to sacrament meeting right away, but you're getting a lot closer to me actually showing up and sitting in the pews at that point. And this is not me believing in the truth claims, right? Like that's a different thing. But we're a lot closer at that point to it being like an organization that like I could be proud to be a part of. And even I don't have to believe in everything that an organization says to want to be a part of it,
Yeah. Oh, so. All right. Well, Tyler, I think this has been fun. It's been a good discussion to talk about your story and your deconstruction, and it's always nice to meet people. I had this sort of this way I envisioned you from all the comments, and you're a lot different to what I imagined.
Old man, right?
Oh yeah, this angry guy in his 50s bald. That's kind of what I imagined. But you're just this nice nerd.
Total dork when you get to know me. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think I have any other questions unless there's anything else you want to say before we go. I guess maybe I'll ask you this one last question. Is there anything you think we could do better in this space, both as ex-Mormons or critics, apologists and believers, with just having better engagement, more civil dialogue? I think in a way it's almost impossible to get rid of the us versus them. It's quite funny. I sometimes listen to like animal attack videos, and I was watching recently like who'd win versus lion versus tiger, because I don't know, I just find some stuff interesting. And there's even an us versus them between like, no, the lion would totally win, no, the tiger, and they're always going against each other. And I thought it was kind of funny because it's such a trivial thing, and actually it's more complicated than what you would think. As I've been looking into it, my money would still maybe be on a tiger, but it really depends on like so many factors.
Yeah,
But
I think I'm with you on that one. I think I would bet on the tiger in most instances because of the way they hunt.
but
Um,
yeah, so much depends on like
yep,
size, the subspecies of tiger, weight,
prep time. You know, do the no, that's
is it a
Batman. Sorry.
lioness? Right, yeah, like, it's kind of fascinating. And then I was watching a video and it talked about like studies have said that tigers can weigh up to 660 pounds, but actually normally it's between like I don't know what is 450 to 500. So this changes the equation. I was kind of like, oh, okay, this is interesting. I don't know who I bet my money on. It probably depends. And then like looking up who's won more fights historically, it's very hard to get like firm data.
Yeah.
But anyway, getting back to my question, not lions versus tigers. What do you think? Do you think it's possible, or do you think it's not possible to have better dialogue between each other?
I believe in the goodness of humanity to the point up to almost to a fault. It's maybe a problem, honestly. So I do believe it's possible. I have to my fellow, exmos or critics and all of that. Like, I would say, take the time that you need to deal with the emotions, get that out of your system. Try not to engage so much with believers when you're going through that. It's okay to sit in like spaces with believers and to listen and all that, but in terms of what you're putting out there, give it a minute, breathe, talk to the exmos, get on r/x Mormon and say whatever like filthy thing you want to there. It's fine. Do it there. And get it out of your system. And then when you sit down with a believer, understand you used to be there. You used to think the same things that they do. You're not any better than they are. You're not any smarter than they are. Like, and just have a civil conversation. To the believing side of it, listen to what we have to say. Please. Like, sometimes it's just wanting to be heard. Sometimes that's all we need is to feel like we're being heard by those who like are in this community still, who are still benefiting from this community that we used to love, or that we do still love, but feel like we don't belong in anymore. And believe us when we are sharing those stories. Don't try to ascribe motive or those sorts of things. Like, we went through most odds are the person you're talking to sincerely went through the experiences that they went through, and they sincerely tried to make the gospel work for them, and it just didn't anymore. And I think that if you start from that premise, from that base, and just assume the best, assume good intent from each other, that's at least a start. It's hard because eventually like our worldviews start to really diverge in some ways, but the John Larson comment about ex-Mormons just being a different variety of Mormon does hold true as well. And so the same sorts of like cultural dogmas and all of that come into play. But we do see a divergence in the way that we view the world over time, and that can be another struggle to reconcile. But yeah, just listen to each other. If you're going to sit in the space, be kind, aim for kindness. And I think like what John Dehlin says as well about like it's about institutions, not people. We can be critical of the institution of the church, and all that. You can be critical of the Open Stories Foundation. Be critical of the Open Stories Foundation, whatever. That's fine, and all of that. But like the people that are involved in that, like have the compassion and the empathy for. I think that's kind of the basis that I try to run off of. I think it works. I think when people aim for that, things turn out a little bit better. And sometimes it's just hard to do that. Sometimes it's hard to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but that's exactly what Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, right? About if a man compels you to go a mile, go with him twain, right? Just stick with him for that extra mile, and love your enemies and all of that. If we're not following those principles, what kind of Christians, what kind of a Christian are you if you're not? And even if you're not a believing person, those are still values that are worth holding to. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually really sound advice. I agree with a lot of that. Like, yeah, if you're a former member, still see the humanity of the people that still believe, empathize. You were once there, and particularly people who are still Latter-day Saints. If you see people leave or you're critical of the church, it doesn't really help anybody if you attack back. Like, yes, I'm all for engaging, trying to contend or defend the faith, but I think we can try to do it in more Christ-like ways. In a way, sometimes we can engage in sort of propaganda, apologetics, and it can just be very polarizing. And then for all you know, What if somebody comes back to the
Yeah.
church who once left, and you sort of fueled the fire of their unbelief or animosity against the
Mhm.
church in some ways?
Yep.
That would not be
And
good.
how many people talk about losing their faith because they're seeing like the apologetics that are like just nasty apologetics, right? Like
Yeah.
there's a lot of expos that talk about that experience. So be an example into the believers as well. I think is worth that's worth the effort. And be an example of the believers as well of the good of the church because the saying of the church is perfect but the members aren't, I think is in reverse. Like I really think that the members are awesome for the most part. I think your average member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is somebody that is trustworthy and kind and patient and loving and all of that, and is better than the church that they're in. And I understand that might not be the thing that a believer wants to hear, but it's something that I do think is true. So
And you've also got your own channel or podcast.
yeah,
You want to plug it? Briefly, just say
So
what it is and
yeah, so if you're
where we can
really
find it.
interested in some goofy conversations about the Book of Mormon, my co-host and I have kind of had some changes in life circumstances that have made that a little bit rough. But if you look up the Lolo and Perry channel on YouTube, we've got a series of come follow me videos that go up into Alma rather. We're not through Alma. And yeah, life circumstances just coming in this summer just really rocked us hard. We also have a couple of responses to some of your videos as
Oh, okay.
well. And and then I had this grand goal of responding to your 10 evidences, and I have a lot of the notes written for that, and I recorded about 2 hours of it, and then my slides got wonky. And anyway, I haven't gotten back to that, and life circumstance
You can
got
always
worse.
put that
Anyway,
up in December episodes. I'd be interested to watch that. Let me know whenever that comes out.
I do fully intend at some point in time doing a full response to your 10 evidences video.
I'll have to do a response to. I'll have to do
Yeah,
a debunking of the debunking because
yeah,
it'll just keep
let's
going
just go
on.
back and forth on it for a while. It'll be fun. Just create that Earl Burroughs and but yeah,
Well, very
yeah.
good. Yeah, and people go check out that channel or podcast. What's the name of it? Sorry,
Lolo and Perry. We did Come
Lolo and
Follow Me
Perry.
with Lolo and Perry. And yeah,
Okay.
lots of you know, um, it's fun. We tried to keep it as friendly as possible to as many sites as we could, but definitely get a little bit spicy in some places on a couple of things. So just be aware of that we are talking from a certain perspective and we're not engaging directly with apologists, where we might have handled some conversations a little bit differently if we were doing that.
Oh,
So
that's good to know. And if
yeah.
people ever see, what's your name on YouTube? Is it Perry something McKay or
Perry Ekimai. Ekimai is the
Ekimai?
yeah.
Okay.
So Ekimai is the Japanese phrase for like someone gets in front of the train station. And I was like referring to like I used to, when I was visiting like in Japan, I would say like the hotels that were like the Ekimai hotels. And yeah, I just kind of picked that up because I was in Japan in 2020 and wanted something that kind of riffed off that. So Perry
I guess people
Ekimai.
now can put a face to the name if they see you commenting on my future videos.
Yep,
And
I am not an anthropomorphic duck.
I was kind of thinking, I was like, that's a strange surname if that's your surname. Uh, but no, and it's been good meeting you, hearing your story.
It's been a pleasure.
Best of luck in with your life and your journey and wherever it leads, and keep
Yeah,
engaging with my stuff as well, and maybe we'll
thank you.
dialogue again.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be here, and I do hope that there's another opportunity to kind of jam again. This is fun.
Yeah, listeners who've been watching, if you enjoy this, give it a like, comment underneath as well, your thoughts as well. Share, and don't forget to subscribe, and reach out if you'd like to come on and share a story. I've had people who have come on who've either been through a faith crisis and who have come through with faith, or I've also interviewed people who have left the church as well. So welcome to those people.
Donate to the
Next time.
Patreon.
Oh yes, donate on Patreon as well. Donations have dropped, so donate as well because this takes a lot of time, a lot of work making videos as well. See you next time. Bye bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.